1920s fashion for women characterized the free-spirited, modernist era of the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age as women gained their freedom and independence. The 1920s fashion trend were clothes that provided freedom of movement with looser fitting clothes and defined by the adoption of the chemise, which is the loose-fitting undergarment that replaced the confining, tight-fitting corsets of the Victorian era. The waist on the dresses descended as the hemline rose. The evening dresses reflect the fact that people had money. From the materials to the accessories, they were all elegant and expensive. The bell-shaped cloche hat was a defining fashion statement in the 1920s. The hats were typically made of felt and were designed to be worn low on the forehead. For evening wear, cloche hats were made from beads or lace. The short bob haircut also became very popular. The style symbolized the independent and modern woman of the 1920s. The 1920s marked the beginning of an unprecedented era of freedom for women. The Roaring Twenties was a time of prosperity and elegance for many. Not only did they gain the right to vote in 1920, but women also began to play a more active role in sports, social life, and even in the workplace.
During World War II, men were in war and women gained independence. The women would work in factories and offices. After the hardship of the war, everyone was waiting for a change, so by the 1950s, everyone was wearing the new look. When men returned from the war, women also returned to their home as wife, mother, or homemaker. Women will represent their husband by their appearance, because their appearance show their husband's success. Celebrations were going on and women would wear skirts and bright clothes for dancing to entertain men. Women were expected to be impacably dressed and groomed, while men wore serious and somber business suits. Due to the war, the US made a huge investment in mass production and used them to create new clothing. The 50s eventually backfired as it get close to the 1960s. Young teenagers feel trapped and they didn't want to look like their parents. In 1960, hippie became a fashion and it was a way for them to express themselves.
The 70s was an era where individuality was beginning to be emphasized, where you could be one of many styles and still technically be following 70s trends. The 70s brought an era of groundbreaking fashion. This included a disco craze. Disco clothing was a mix of fashions together. It was characterized by different hairstyles, accessories, and overall standout outfits. Shiny dresses, tops, jumpsuits, and bell-bottoms were huge in disco style. There was a lack of distinction between men's and women's wear. Both men and women wore high-waisted pants with flare legs as well as button-down shirts. There was really no strict layout for what exactly disco fashion was. Disco fashion was popularized by TV shows such as Soul Train. Many people got their ideas for outfits from dancers and performers on the show. Soul Train helped shape disco culture overall and played a big part in creating an image of what 70s disco fashion was.
If I were you, I'd take precaution. Before I step to
1980s. The fashion trend in the 1980s was inspired by the advertisements on TV. This was one of the simpler times in history where Reagan was in the White House and the internet was becoming widely used. The early 1980s were very different from the rest of the decade, with some carryover from the late 1970s. There was less emphasis on accessories and clothing colors were quiet and basic. Varying shades of brown, tan, and orange were common. Fashionable clothing in the early 1980s included both unisex and gender-specific attire. Widespread fashions for women in the early 1980s included sweaters, leather jacks, crop tops, mini skirts, knee-length dresses made in a variety of fabrics, high-waisted loose pants, leather pants, and designer jeans. Women's pants of the 1980s were, in general, worn with long inseams, a style carried over from the 1970s. Men. 1980s clothing styles for men included acid-wash jeans, jean jackets, and high-top shoes and t-shirts. Overall, some of the greatest fashion trend of the 80s included fanny packs, mini skirts, and spandex. The 1980s saw the emergence of dance music and new wave. As disco fell out of fashion in the decade's early years, genres such as post-disco, Italo disco, Euro disco, and dance pop became more popular. Rock music continued to enjoy a wide audience.
This is how we do it.
The 90s was an era of memorable fashion. Overall, 90s fashion was colorful clothing and loose-fitting except for grunge styles. The 90s was a split into many fashion trends. There was a mix of elegant clothing and street style, which was inspired by schoolgirl clothing and by movies like Clueless. And then there was street style that was usually oversized and somewhat sporty. The style had an overdose of denim and leather jackets. In this era, many mainstream hip-hop artists, movie stars, and supermodels had a major influence on what people wore. The decade also saw the rising of boy bands, girl groups, pop stars, and R&B singers, and they inspired fashion through many outlets, one of them being MTV. TV shows such as Friends inspired teens. Jennifer Aniston's character Rachel was a popular trendsetter. Also, supermodels like Naomi Campbell and Kate Moss and Tyra Banks were it girls during this time, and everyone wanted to look like them. Then, apart from this all, there was the grunge looks, which was characterized by flannel and loose-fitting jeans. Thrift store clothing was in more than any other time. The 90s is iconic because many of the looks in this era are finding its way back into mainstream fashion trends.
Fashion trends are important to our history because each era represents how people during that time expressed themselves. The 20th century was filled with standout eras such as the 50s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. These eras highlight the changing standards of what clothing was accepted by society. Fashion helped create a unique culture, and without it, people wouldn't be able to practice self-expression. To many, fashion is a sense of freedom.